I would never have believed that a simple medical checkup could mark the beginning of a whirlwind of emotions that would upset my existence. It all started with a chest discomfort, a pain I had neglected for weeks, until my worried husband convinced me to make an appointment with our new family doctor. I didn't have high expectations. Ultimately, a doctor is just a doctor. But that day, crossing the threshold of that studio, everything changed. Dr. Ricardo was a man in his 40s, with dark hair lightly streaked with gray and penetrating eyes that seemed to peer into your soul. There was something about him, an aura of confidence and mystery that struck me immediately. I couldn't stop looking at him as he asked me about my health, my daily habits. His way of speaking, of meeting my gaze, was different from that of any other doctor I had met. It wasn't just her looks that captivated me, but also the way she made me feel at the center of the world, as if everything else disappeared. I had been married to Stefano for 10 years, and even though I loved him, something in our relationship had changed over time. Maybe it was the routine, maybe the hardships of daily life, but that initial spark seemed to have faded. With Ricardo, however, I felt a new energy, a dormant desire that resurfaced in me after a long time. When I left the office, my heart was beating faster, and not just from the pain in my chest. I knew that brief encounter had awakened something forbidden, a curiosity that I couldn't ignore. Over the next few days, I couldn't help but think about him. Every night his face invaded my dreams, and his image tormented me like an obsession. I saw myself in his arms, felt the warmth of his body next to mine. I tried to push those thoughts away, reminding myself that I was a married woman, but it was as if my mind had decided to follow its own path. In a moment of weakness, I made a decision. I booked another visit, even though the pain in my chest had now eased. This time I wasn't looking for a diagnosis, but a pretext to see him again, to listen to his voice, to feel those looks that made me feel alive. When I entered the study, Ricardo welcomed me with the same warm smile I remembered. But this time, I noticed something different. His eyes seemed more intense, as if he too sensed that tension hanging between us. During the visit, our eyes met several times, and each time my heart seemed to skip a beat. I tried to stay calm, but I felt the attraction growing, like a current that dragged me without me being able to resist. When I left his office, I felt confused, excited, but also tormented by guilt. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop. The days passed, and every thought about Ricardo was accompanied by a mixture of fear and desire. Finally, I gathered courage and sent a message to the doctor's office, asking for an urgent appointment. When he answered, his warm voice made me tremble. I explained to him, with a banal excuse, that the pain in my chest was back and that I needed to get checked out. He proposed to meet me that same evening, after closing time. That evening, I got ready like I hadn't done in years. I wore a light, slightly low-cut dress that highlighted my curves. I carefully put on makeup, leaving my hair loose on my shoulders. When I entered his studio, Ricardo welcomed me with a smile that seemed to hide something. The visit began like all the others. He checked my breathing, listened to my heartbeat, but the atmosphere was different. The air seemed saturated with electricity. His every touch on my skin burned like fire. Then with an unexpected gesture, he stopped. He looked me straight in the eyes and in a low, emotion-filled voice said, "I have something to confess to you. Since you first entered this office, I can't stop thinking about you." My heart skipped a beat. Those words hit me like lightning. I approached him, not knowing exactly what I was doing, and whispered, "Me too." Our lips met in a kiss that seemed inevitable, filled with a passion that had remained dormant for too long. His hands held me tightly, and I abandoned myself completely to him. In that moment, everything else disappeared. The world, my husband, the doubts. Only he and I existed, united in a desire that could no longer be ignored. Every touch was an explosion of sensations, a vortex that made me lose all control. In those moments, my husband and the possible consequences faded from my mind, replaced by a burning, uncontrollable desire. Ricardo took me by the waist confidently and lifted me slightly, making me sit on the edge of the medical table. His hands, warm and firm, slid under my dress, igniting my skin with a touch that made me tremble. Every centimeter he touched seemed to vibrate with new life. The hours passed without us realizing it. There was no room for remorse, only for the passion that consumed us both. When we finally stopped, our breaths were labored, and between us there was a strange complicity, an invisible but undeniable bond. His eyes met mine, and Ricardo smiled, a smile that betrayed his apparent sense of guilt. "I should never have done this," he murmured, but the tone of his voice betrayed every word. "Me neither," I replied weakly, knowing full well how wrong it was. Yet there was no doubt in my mind. I wanted to continue, to take another risk. Ricardo was the risk I was willing to take. That evening I returned home with a confused mind and a still beating heart. Stefano, my husband, welcomed me with his usual kind smile, completely unaware of what had just happened. A wave of guilt washed over me, so intense that I had to hold back tears. How could I have betrayed his trust so impulsively? Yet every time I closed my eyes, it was Ricardo's hands that returned to my thoughts, his touch that made me feel alive in a way that hadn't happened in years. That thought tore me apart and excited me at the same time. From that moment on, our forbidden encounter became a shared secret. It all started with seemingly innocent messages, but full of meaning. Simple phrases like, "How are you today?" They hid a world of desire and unspoken promises. Every time the phone vibrated, my heart skipped a beat. Ricardo was looking for me, and I couldn't help but answer. We organized secret meetings in his studio after closing time, or in small cafes outside the city, away from prying eyes. Every meeting was a risk, a step closer and closer to the edge of the precipice. I felt divided between two worlds, the stable and safe one with Stefano, and the unknown and exciting one with Ricardo. I no longer knew which of the two I really belonged to. The more days passed, the more the lies piled up. I had to invent increasingly elaborate excuses to justify my absences: a work commitment, a meeting with an old friend, a walk to clear my head. Every time I looked Stefano in the eyes, I felt myself sinking into a sea of shame. But just one message from Ricardo was enough to make me forget everything. I had become a prisoner of that uncontrollable desire, unable to break that invisible chain that bound us. Every time I saw him, the world around us seemed to disappear. It was as if we were two flames consuming each other, regardless of the consequences. How long could I keep this double life going? I realized that, sooner or later, the truth would come out. But until that moment, I was determined to live every moment to the fullest, even if it meant burning myself. Every meeting with Ricardo was a discovery, an exploration of a side of me that I didn't know. He showed me places far from my everyday life, making me feel emotions I had never experienced. On one of those evenings, he took me to a restaurant hidden in the hills, an intimate place with dim lights and jazz music in the background. There, I felt freer than ever, far from the responsibilities of a wife and close to the real me. Ricardo took my hand on the table and looked at me intensely. "What do you like most about all this?" he asked, in that low, charming voice. I stared at him, searching for the right words. "The feeling of being alive," I replied, almost in a whisper, surprised by my own sincerity. It wasn't just the betrayal. It wasn't just the passion. It was that feeling of rediscovering who I was, of finding a part of myself that I thought was lost. He smiled and squeezed my hand tighter. "I feel that way about you too," he admitted. "Have you ever found yourself faced with a choice that could completely turn your life upside down? Tell me in the comments, how far would you be willing to go to rediscover yourself?" My heart filled with joy, but also with fear. What did all this mean to him? And what did it mean for me? We walked home together that evening. The journey was silent, but full of tension. His hand remained on mine the whole time, and I felt his thumb tracing light circles on the back of my hand. I knew that each meeting was bringing us closer and closer to a point of no return. Was I ready to risk everything for him? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I would keep looking for it every time his eyes landed on mine. As the weeks passed, my behavior began to arouse suspicion. Marco, always attentive and thoughtful, began to notice my constant delays and sudden absences. He asked me more and more direct questions, trying to understand where I had been and with whom. His once gentle eyes were now more inquisitive, and I felt more and more trapped in my own lies. One evening, while we were having dinner, Marco stared at me with a serious expression, one I had never seen on him before. "Something's wrong, right?" he asked me. My heart skipped a beat. I tried to stay calm, to smile as if nothing had happened. "What are you talking about?" I replied, trying to sound innocent, but I felt the heat rising to my face, betraying my embarrassment. Marco, however, could see beyond my words. "I sense you're distant," he continued in a soft but firm tone. "You're not the same anymore. I see you thoughtful, distracted. What's happening?" For a moment I was tempted to tell him everything, to free myself from the burden that oppressed me, but the terror of losing him, of destroying our marriage, paralyzed me. So I lied again. "It's just work," I said, looking down. "I'm tired, that's all." Marco nodded slowly, but I saw doubt in his eyes. He wasn't convinced. That night, as he slept next to me, I felt a lump tighten in my throat. I knew that every day that passed brought the moment when the truth would come out closer and closer. Meanwhile, the bond with Ricardo intensified. Every meeting was a whirlwind of emotions and desires, a leap into the void without a safety net. I felt torn between two worlds, a stable and reassuring one, with Marco, and an unknown and overwhelming one with Ricardo. I knew I would soon have to choose. One afternoon, while I was in Ricardo's study, he stared at me with an intensity that left me speechless. "We have to decide what to do," he said, in a tone that mixed sweetness and seriousness. "We cannot continue like this, with lies and secrets." His words hit me like a blow to the chest. He was right. I had reached a crossroads, and I could no longer live in that limbo. But how could I choose between the man who had accompanied me for so many years and the one who had rekindled a part of me that I thought was lost? I didn't know what to answer. For the first time, I saw a hint of disappointment in Ricardo's eyes. "You have to take time to figure out what you really want," he told me, his voice full of barely concealed fear. I knew he was afraid of losing me, and that knowledge tormented me. The situation became unbearable when Marco, increasingly suspicious, began to follow me. One evening, as I was leaving Ricardo's study, I saw him across the street. His face was a mask of anger and pain, his eyes fixed on me and Ricardo as we walked side by side. Our hands touched, and in that moment I knew I had been discovered. That evening at home, Marco didn't give me time to explain. "How long has this story been going on?" he asked me, his voice cracking with emotion. "How could you betray me like that?" His every word was a stab. The tears started to fall, but I knew they wouldn't be enough to justify what I had done. I felt the weight of my choices crushing me. "I'm sorry," I whispered between sobs. "I don't know what to do. I don't know who I've become." Marco didn't answer immediately. Long moments of tension-filled silence passed. Then, in a cold voice, he said he needed time and decided to move away from me to think. I was left alone with my thoughts and my pain. Ricardo tried to contact me several times, but I never responded. I knew I had to get my life in order, figure out who I was and what I really wanted. After sleepless nights, I made a decision. I called Ricardo and told him we couldn't see each other anymore. I explained to him that I had to try to rebuild my marriage, to rediscover the love I had for Marco, even though I knew it would be a long and difficult journey. Ricardo remained silent for a few moments. Then, in a sad but understanding voice, he replied, "I understand. I hope you find the peace you seek." Marco, over time, decided to give me a second chance. It wasn't an easy journey. Every day was a challenge, a step towards a new understanding and a new beginning. As for Ricardo, I never saw him again. But the memory of what we had shared stayed with me as a valuable lesson in what it really means to love and betray. Maybe I would never go back to being the woman I was, but from that moment on, I vowed to always be honest. First of all, with myself. If you want to receive new videos of the series, write "I want the sequel" in the comments. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to receive a preview of future publications. Thank you.